Washington, John R. Bolton, the former National Security Advisor, privately told Attorney General William P. Barr last year that he had concerns that President Trump was effectively granting personal favors to the autocratic leaders of Turkey and China, according to an unpublished manuscript by Mr. Bolton.
Mr. Barr responded by pointing to a pair of Justice Department investigations of companies in those countries and said he was worried that Mr. Trump had created the appearance that he had undue influence over what would typically be independent inquiries, according to the manuscript. Backing up his point, Mr. Barr mentioned conversations Mr. Trump had with the leaders, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey and President Xi Jinping of China.
Mr. Bolton's account underscores the fact that the unease about Mr. Trump's seeming embrace of authoritarian leaders, long expressed by experts and his opponents, also existed among some of the senior cabinet officers entrusted by the president to carry out his foreign policy and national security agendas.
Mr. Bolton recounted his discussion with Mr. Barr in a draft of an unpublished book manuscript that he submitted nearly a month ago to the White House for review. People familiar with the manuscript described its contents on the condition of anonymity.
The book also contains an account of Mr. Trump telling Mr. Bolton in August that he wanted to continue freezing $391 million in security assistance to Ukraine until officials there helped with investigations of political rivals, The New York Times reported on Sunday. The matter is at the heart of the articles of impeachment against the president.
A Justice Department spokeswoman declined to comment on Mr. Barr's conversations with Mr. Bolton, as did a spokesman for the National Security Council. In a statement on Monday, Mr. Bolton, his publisher and his literary agency said they had not shared the manuscript with the Times.
There was absolutely no coordination with The New York Times or anyone else regarding the appearance of information about his book, The Room Where It Happened, at online booksellers. Mr. Bolton, Simon & Schuster and Javelin said in a joint statement. Any assertion to the contrary is unfounded speculation.
Dean Baquet, the executive editor of The Times, responded that The Times does not discuss its sources, but I should point out that no one has questioned the accuracy of our report.
Mr. Bolton wrote in the manuscript that Mr. Barr singled out Mr. Trump's conversations with Mr. Xi about the Chinese telecommunications firm ZTE, which agreed in 2017 to plead guilty and pay heavy fines for violating American sanctions on doing business with North Korea, Iran and other countries. A year later, Mr. Trump lifted the sanctions over objections from his own advisers and Republican lawmakers.
Mr. Barr also cited remarks Mr. Trump made to Mr. Erdogan in 2018 about the investigation of Halkbank, Turkey's second-largest state-owned bank. The Justice Department was scrutinizing Halkbank on fraud and money laundering charges for helping Iran evade sanctions imposed by the Treasury Department.
Mr. Erdogan had been making personal appeals to Mr. Trump to use his authority to halt any additional enforcement against the bank. In 2018, Mr. Erdogan told reporters in Turkey that Mr. Trump had promised to instruct cabinet members to follow through on the matter. The bank had hired a top Republican fundraiser to lobby the administration on the issue.
For months, it looked as though the unusual lobbying effort might succeed, but in October, the Justice Department indicted the bank for aiding Iran. The charges were seen in part as an attempt by the administration to show that it was taking a tough line on Turkey amid an outcry over Mr. Trump's endorsement of its incursions in Syria.
Mr. Bolton's statements in the book align with other comments he has made since leaving the White House in September. In November, he said in a private speech that none of Mr. Trump's advisers shared the president's views on Turkey and that he believed Mr. Trump adopted a more permissive approach to the country because of his financial ties there. NBC News reported, Mr. Trump's company has a property in Turkey.
Mr. Trump has repeatedly praised dictators throughout his presidency. Last year, he said, "Where's my favorite dictator?" as he waited to meet with President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of Egypt, The Wall Street Journal reported.
Mr. Trump's soft spot for authoritarians dates at least to his presidential campaign, when he praised Saddam Hussein for being good at killing terrorists and suggested that the world would be better off were Colonel Muammar el-Gaddafi, the deposed Libyan dictator who was killed in a violent uprising in 2011, in charge right now. Mr. Trump then suggested the ouster of both men was ultimately worse for the Middle East because the Islamic State had filled the void.
Mr. Trump declared himself a big fan of Mr. Erdogan as they sat side by side in the Oval Office last fall after Mr. Trump cleared the way for Turkish forces to invade Syria, though he warned Mr. Erdogan behind the scenes against the offensive.
Of Mr. Xi, Mr. Trump has been similarly effusive. When the Chinese Communist Party eliminated term limits, allowing Mr. Xi to keep his tenure open-ended, Mr. Trump extolled the outcome.
Mr. Xi had personally asked Mr. Trump to intervene to save ZTE, which was on the brink of collapse because of tough American penalties for sanctions violations.
Lifting the sanctions on ZTE, a Chinese telecommunications giant that also serves as a geopolitical pawn for its government, most likely helped Mr. Trump negotiate with Mr. Xi in the trade war between the two countries. But Republican lawmakers and others objected to helping a Chinese company that broke the law and has been accused of posing a national security threat.
Mr. Bolton's reputation for muscular foreign policy was always an odd fit with Mr. Trump, who often threatens excessive force but rarely reacts with it. Mr. Bolton was pleased when Mr. Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal between Iran and 6 world powers, including the United States, that the Obama administration had entered into. Other Trump advisers had urged him against it.
But Mr. Trump's lack of action after Iranian aggression against the United States rankled Mr. Bolton.
Mr. Bolton's book has already netted significant sales. Shortly after the disclosure of its contents on Sunday night, Amazon listed the book for purchase. By Monday evening, it was number 17 on Amazon's bestseller list.
Eric Lipton contributed reporting.